90 to 95% of all leafy greens and lettuce for the entire United States comes from two spots: Salinas Valley, California, and Yuma, Arizona. So a literal desert, and then an area that has consistently been going through drought and is now in a super drought. So you're in New York, Silas. 9 times out of 10, when you eat a salad, don't think that it comes from Pennsylvania or New Jersey or even Missouri or anywhere east of the Mississippi. 90% probability it comes from California, 3,000 miles away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 65 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to bring this to you, and thank you again for tuning into the show. As always, we want to make mention that if you are a founder in the climate tech space and are looking for support, please feel free to reach out to us. We're glad to help in any way we can, making introductions to people who have formerly been on the show, potential partnerships that you're looking for, or perhaps raising capital. Please feel free to reach out. Always glad to have an impromptu conversation and see what we can do. So on today's episode, we are speaking with Eddy Badrina, the CEO of Eden Green Technologies. Eden is a vertical farming technology company that is primarily focused on the growing, at least presently, of lettuce at a commodity scale. So in today's episode, Eddy walks us through a number of things, including the challenges of other vertical growers, kind of just generally speaking, the challenges of a vertical growing farm, and then also compares some of the different business models. We discussed food insecurity due to climate change. We have, of course, discussed how their technology works and kind of the return on investment. And then we also discussed what their future and the future of vertical farming looks like generally, as well as how they are not only farming kind of lettuce, of course, but they're also taking a very interesting approach to talent and essentially farming their own talent, bringing career growth to the farming industry in a way that really, from what I understand, has not really been seen before. So it's very fascinating. That perhaps is my most fascinating aspect of the show for me personally. But generally speaking, really great episode with Eddy. Super glad we could bring this to you. And as of course, before we get into the show, we do want to make mention and thanks to our sponsors, Next Wave Partners. Next Wave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if you your team is growing or you personally are looking for a career change, feel free to reach out to them at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. And also, if you are interested in becoming a sponsor of the show, feel free to reach out to me. My email can be found in the description, or you can reach me directly through our Slack channel. So with that, without any further delay, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the show, Eddy. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Silas?
I'm doing super well. I'm extremely excited to have you on. We have not had many people in this space, so I think this is going to be a great episode. Why don't you, I guess, start off with just giving us a quick introduction to yourself and how you ended up here?
Yeah, so my name's Eddy Badrina. I'm the CEO of Eden Green, and it is a vertical greenhouse. So it's a combination of things that you may have seen on TV or in news articles of a greenhouse that gets 100% of sunlight plus vertical farms, which take advantage of the cubic volume within a structure, right? So, I mean, how I got here is such I would say it's a pretty circuitous road. It's for your listeners, it's a testament to just because you started out somewhere doesn't mean you have to end up in that field or track. And then likewise, just because you want to get somewhere else, it doesn't mean you have to, you're not stuck there in the track, and then you can come from anywhere. For me, actually, started with a degree in psychology of all things, and then got a master's in public administration and international affairs. So I divide my career into 3 chapters. One is government, where I was in foreign policy. And then for 2 years, I was President Bush's Asian American spokesperson. Then my second chapter is I started a company, a digital marketing firm, bootstrapped it from scratch, no loans, no lines of credit, just straight cash flow. Grew it, sold it 2016, bought it back 11 months later, and then continued running it And then I had this moment in my life where I was trying to figure out what to do next. I had this successful company. My business partner and I were running it pretty successfully the second time. And I just felt like I wanted to do something else. So from there, I had a chance to jump onto Eating Green, which is sort of my third chapter of my career, if you will. And that's where I am now.
And so how did you end up deciding or kind of coming across the idea to go into the space in general?
So, the idea was not mine. It really was, the genesis was as I was sitting there running BuzzShift, which was my previous company with my business partner. While my head was there and I wanted to be a good steward of that company and to be a good leader to the employees there, my heart was kind of going in a different direction, right? So that different direction, I think there are three important steps that I had to do to really make the jump. One was I had to articulate what I wanted. I think a lot of folks probably listening in, but even fellow leaders, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, they struggle with in their professional and personal life to articulate and identify what they want. And I think some people don't want to admit what they want because they may be afraid of what other people will think of that. They may be saying, oh man, I want to do this, but it's totally out of my skill set or totally different than my career path. And either people around me will think less of me for it, or people in the industry won't accept me because of X, Y, or Z, right? But for whether or not, I don't even want to make judgment calls on what people want. The fact that you can articulate what you want is probably the first step, right? I know a handful of guys and gals who what they want do not line up with my belief system or where I think they will end up, right, in life from some of their choices. But at least they're honest about what they want and they're going to go after that, right? So I think if you can do that, and it's what I was able to do after a period of time, I'll call it 9 months to a year, was to really articulate what I wanted. And that the three things that I wanted was I wanted to run a hardware software company. I had been there, done that, and gotten the t-shirt for professional services. The second is I wanted to have an exponential impact on society and culture. So for every 1 unit of effort that I put out, I wanted to see a 10 to 20x return on culture around me. And then the third thing I wanted is to run what's known as a redemptive organization. And so there's a group out of New York called Praxis Labs. If you look them up, you'll discover that they have sort of this framework for thinking about an organization where where leaders are sacrificial, where employees are treated very generously, and where society is not just it's not just an additive to a society, it's actually renewing or transforming that culture. So those are the three things that I wanted to do. I articulated those as succinctly as I just articulated to you, right? Which takes a lot of time to be able to shrink those down into those really, really concisely worded buckets. The second thing I did is I had to pass it among family and friends. And the reason I did that, and I was very open with them about it, was because I wanted to know that it was coming from a healthy place and not from, what the Bible calls selfish ambition or vain conceit, right? I want it to be healthy for me and I wanted to be healthy for my family. So if I wanted to go off and pursue something and my friends or my colleagues or my family was like, man, that's totally off or that's going to wreck your family, then that's something I needed to hear. So that's the second thing I did was pass it through that filter of family and colleagues. And then the last thing I did was I had to just let it go, right? Because I had been charged to be diligent and excellent with this company, BuzzShift. But since my heart was over here, I had to be good with both of those. I had to hold to those in equal tensions and equal weights. So once I was able to do that, as I was talking with other colleagues, a friend of mine who was familiar with Eating Green and where it was, put me on to Eating Green, put me in front of their lead investors. And then, then I was able to have the opportunity to take over in the CEO role.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. And it's fascinating. I actually have heard of Praxis Labs because I went through a program called Discover Praxis. And in the course of researching it, I actually had found that. It's quite an odd coincidence, but no, I think that's really fascinating story, and I think it's quite interesting to hear your thought process and how you ended up coming to that conclusion. I think it's quite interesting and quite prudent. I guess you mentioned in the beginning, but let's kind of dive into a little bit deeper what exactly Eden is doing, and can you just kind of explain it at a very holistic perspective, so for people who are completely unfamiliar?
Sure. So the best way to look at it is what we're trying to solve for, right? And the big challenge in the produce industry right now, and in food supply in general, is that we've got a real supply chain problem when it comes to food. So we saw that but even before the pandemic, you could probably see the cracks in the system. But after the pandemic hit and supply chain has continued to be for the past couple of years a real problem in terms of transportation costs, in terms of labor, and then you tack on the environmental changes that we've had, what you get is a really inconsistent and unreliable source of produce. So a lot of people don't know this. Actually, the vast majority of people don't know this, but 90 to 95% of all leafy greens and lettuce for the entire United States comes from two spots: Salinas Valley, California, and Yuma, Arizona. So a literal desert, and then an area that has consistently been going through drought and is now in a super drought. So you're in New York, Silas. 9 times out of 10, when you eat a salad, don't think that it comes from Pennsylvania or New Jersey or even Missouri or anywhere east of the Mississippi. 90% probability it comes from California, 3,000 miles away. So when you talk about consistency, when you talk about freshness, when you talk about affordability, when you talk about nutrition and waste, man, that is a high bar to hurdle when it comes to the challenges that we face. So that's what we're solving for, right? And when you think about the current solutions, some of them are scalable, some of them are affordable, some of them are consistent, none or all three until now. So on the scalable end, you've got community gardens, and you'll hear people say, well, we need to grow in our backyards and we need to grow in community gardens. And we have these tower gardens that fit on our patio porches. That's great, but it's not going to feed a population. No, they're just people who can't afford to do that, who don't have the land or the space to do that, right? And then more importantly, it's not consistent. You can't just get that 12 months out of the year. There's going to be weather patterns. There's going to be seasonalities. That's just going to make that impossible. So accessibility and affordability, accessibility and consistency aren't there. So then you have greenhouses and flat tray greenhouses, which if you ever look like in the Netherlands or in France, they're all over the place. The Europeans have really mastered the flat tray greenhouse, automated greatness. Here in the States, you'll see companies that have gone public, like App Harvest and Local Bounty and Gotham Greens. Those are great examples of flat tray greenhouses. The problem with flat tray greenhouses is, from a business standpoint, you cannot get the business returns that you need for commodity level type produce without building those in 60-acre increments, at least. I mean, you look at those ones, all three that I just mentioned, they are building them in huge acreage facility all under roof. When you build like that in that size, there's no way you're going to get it close to a population center. So transportation is still an issue. And if transportation is an issue, then obviously price is an issue, because you have to pay for that transportation somehow. So greenhouses scale, they're consistent, but they don't solve for the pricing equation. On the other end, you've got vertical farms, and you've seen them all also in the news: Aero Farms, In-Farm, Bowery is another one probably up your way, right? Those are really great. They can grow very vertically and densely. But if you ever look in one of those greenhouses and you just look up a photo, like I encourage you to look up Bowery, right? Or Aero Farms is probably a better example. And all you see are lights stacked on lights, stacked on lights, stacked on lights. Basically bunk beds of greens, 36 feet tall. In an 1.5 acre facility of one of those farms that I just mentioned, those vertical farms, you're looking at about 110 to 150,000 lights in there. That's really expensive to build, and it's really expensive to run. So the electricity costs on those vertical farms, those indoor vertical farms, is probably anywhere in the realm of 4 million to 5 million kilowatt hours a month. That's like a data center. So when you think about, okay, if it's that much cost to run that thing, what are you selling that's going to actually give you profit? And to this point at scale, they have not been able to sell things that give them that type of profit, except for microgreens and in some cases, tomatoes. There's some fruiting crops that are out there, berries. Well, let me tell you something. The world doesn't run on microgreens and strawberries. It's just not doing it, right? So there's this whole thing that they have not covered, which is basic commodity level, like lettuce and leafy greens. Right. And if you think, how much lettuce is there actually out there? The TAMs on lettuce, total addressable market size, just domestically in lettuce, is an $8 billion market, growing 10 to 15% year over year. And 90 to 95% of that is coming from those two places that I mentioned before. So that's what we're trying to solve. If you can grow with all the efficiencies of a greenhouse, but in the small, compact footprint of a vertical farm, then all of a sudden you can grow affordably, consistently, and really close to the population. And that's what we do.
Mm-hmm. So could you tell us more about what what the farms look like specifically, and maybe the different variants, because it sounds like there's a little bit of flexibility there.
Absolutely. So if your audience ever wants to, they just go to edengreen.com, like Garden of Eden, green.com. They'll see photos of it. But basically, when most people think of a vertical farm, and I was on another interview, and they just come saying, okay, so it's in this warehouse, or it's in this container. I just said T for timeout. So you've said that about 3 or 4 times. Don't think of warehouse or container. Literally think of a greenhouse. Imagine yourself walking into a 24-foot tall 1.5 acre greenhouse. So the size of a football field, even more, actually larger, 50% larger than a football field, but it's in a greenhouse. And you look up and you see walls and walls of greens. And if you look in those walls, they're towers. They're actually grow towers that have, 36 plant spots on each tower. That is what you would see in one of our greenhouses. And so if you kind of multiply all of those towers that are into rows, and then just put into row after row after row in an 1.5 acre greenhouse structure, sunlight shining down on it, you'll find 328,000 plant spots in an 1.5 acres. Mm-hmm. That can do 13 harvests in a year. And that's conservative, depending on what you're growing. So the volume equivalent of an 1.5 acre Eden Green greenhouse, the volume equivalent is to that of a 45 acre conventional farm.
So the output is the same.
Yes.
Okay. And then could you talk about, I know this is a typical item that usually is brought up, is the water usage for that same amount of output?
Yeah. So the plants, whether they're grown conventionally, they're grown, indoors, in a greenhouse, in a vertical farm, whatever you want to call it, plants always, they transpire, they drink water, right? So the question you should be asking is not how much it consumes, because every plant consumes the same amount of water to grow to a certain size, right? Plants are 85% water. The question is not how much water does it consume? It's how much water does it waste, right? So in a typical farm for 45 acres, producing roughly, call it 2 million pounds of leafy greens, you're going to waste, on average, about 1 million gallons of water. And that 1 million gallons of water that you waste is full of pesticides. It's full of synthetic fertilizers. It's full of whatever the environment, the air, the rain brought in. right? It's full of bird poop. It's full of just everything. And it's running off into your catchment system or into other surrounding farms. Million gallons of water a year. Our system, to grow that same volume of produce, wastes 90,000 gallons of water for the entire year. So my house, the average house in America, wastes 45,000 gallons of water a year. So just to sum that up, in 2 households worth of water waste, we will grow 2 million pounds of leafy greens.
Mm-hmm. Is there any data you have around how many people that typically feed? Just kind of curious, because you mentioned 2 households, and then obviously,
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to know
So
that.
the USDA serving size is about 5 ounces of greens, right? So if you kind of do the math, you're looking at around 6 million servings coming out of an 1.5 acre greenhouse.
Interesting. And are there any other things that have to be present for these greenhouses to work? Probably certain locational kind of parameters that need to fit into?
No, all we need is water and power. That's really all we need. And we can tap into Muni water. We do our own filtration system, reverse osmosis, and then running it through UV lights and sand carbon filters. And then we put our own nutrients in it. We put biomes in it, healthy biomes in it. We level out the pH. And then we send it back out into our closed loop system that then feeds the plants. And so that's probably another thing that, people are asking, how do you get 13 harvests a year out of these plants, right? Well, when you do the water flow like we do, with the nutrients that we do, and in the environment that we do, what you end up getting is the plants get an all-you-can-eat buffet in the perfect environment. And when they can get an all-you-can-eat buffet from top to bottom, left to right, you end up growing plants really fast. So if you go to one of the unique things, I think if you go to our website and see photos, or even the ones behind me, right, there's a consistency from top to bottom. And that's something that we can do that no one else really can, which is grow whole head lettuce, like the type that you get, in the clamshells in the store. They're just this perfectly beautiful heads of lettuce. We can grow whole head lettuce from top to bottom 12 months around the year, and have the same size and same specifications for these grocers. And no one else can do that, not in the volume that we can.
And just to clarify, do I understand correctly that this is all would be grown organically then? This is going to be considered organic?
I think we're better than organic. So here's the deal. Organic is a good certification. It's also a bit of marketing, right? So the reasons organic came about was to ensure, 1, there's no synthetic pesticides. 2, there was, and it's not even GMO, like you can, right? So, but non-GMO, we'll just call it that. No organic, no synthetic pesticides, non-GMO, and really, only the good stuff into the system. And so if you want to talk about like, hey, is yours no synthetic pesticides? Great. Does yours have, all no synthetic nutrients? Great. Is yours, controlled in such a way that it only gets the good stuff? Yes. So we check all the boxes without being organic. And then people, then say, well, what about the soil, and there are biomes in the soil and good bacteria? And, my response to that is, hey, if you can afford to eat the best of the best, then more power to you, right? Like, go eat organic, go eat locally, go eat local community garden greatness. But for the vast majority of America, they just need something safe, nutritious, and consistent to eat, right? That maybe doesn't have the organic label, but is absolutely as safe and as nutritious and is as reliable as organic. Oh, and by the way, it costs less. So the net of it is, for us, what we're trying to do, because our margins are so good on our greenhouses, we're providing USDA fancy and grade 1 produce, but at everyday low prices. that you come to expect, not just at the Walmarts of the world, right? That's a great tagline, but at any other retailer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're really concerned about, is the sort of the trifecta is affordability, consistency, and safety.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and not to mention taste profile.
Yeah.
If you ever taste some of our stuff, come down to our greenhouse, the taste will knock your socks off.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of curious, you talked about a little bit about providing to the grocers, and I'm just kind of curious to understand the model from who are your customers? Is this something you typically Eden Green is doing on their own and selling directly to sellers, or are you working, with cities that want to provide for their people locally or whatnot? How does this work typically?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So most all, if not every single competitor and peer of ours has their own label, right? Their own brand. And that's because from a business perspective, your own brand, while it takes more time to grow, your own brand has more margin. And so a lot of these folks, they backed into their business model because they don't have enough margin at the production level. So they've got to bump that margin up with selling a high-end fixed cost retail brand. That's really great. Go team. But if you ever walk into a grocery store and you tell me, just look, next time, and this is for your audience too, the next time you walk into a grocery store, look at the aisle, look at the fresh produce area, and tell me how much is high-end packaged goods versus private label, white label, and wet wall, the walls where they spray the mists on them. Private label, white label, the grocery owned label, and wet wall probably take up 80% of that. And the high-end premium stuff take about 20% of it. So all of our peers are competing at the high-end level, packaged goods. We have gone the opposite direction, and we are working with grocers, directly with grocers, with their distributors, to do their own private label and white label, which makes it even more astounding to our peers in our industry. They're like, wait a second. So you have USDA fancy and USDA grade 1 produce that's usually meant, for $5-6 a pound, and you're selling it not under your own label. You're actually selling it through the grocer's own private label at $3 a pound. What? That's the astounding thing for people, is they cannot believe we can do it at our prices. And it just really comes down to our technology and how we're growing it, and just the efficiencies. Again, goes back to, can we use as much sunlight as we can, and can we grow densely in a vertical farm? And so that's how we're able to do that with those partners. So it's a long way of saying we sell through distributors directly to private label of grocers. You'll never see our label out there.
Interesting. And I guess, are there any, for people, say, for example, I've always been fascinated by this, if somebody's interested in building one of these themselves, right, they want to invest, and maybe they know that there's a need in their area. Do you also do licensing of the technology?
Not yet. So right now we're building them all on our own within our company. There's 2 ways that people will be able to access us in the future. One is, first of all, as we start expanding, we'll be in more and more, we'll power more and more white labels. And as time goes on, we'll be able to announce what those white labels are. Right now, those white and private labels want to keep it to themselves because we're a bit of a competitive advantage to them. But in the near future, one, you'll be able to know where those are. The second is, we want to be greenhouses infrastructure. So much like a power plant, the Con Eds of the world, the distribution right system, the folks who are distributing your power. No one knows the name of the power plant. That's exactly where we want to be. We want to be the power plants for produce. And so we'll have a mesh network of these all around the United States. So the plan is to have 40 of these in 5 years all around the United States, and then more in the next 5. So at some point, to build more than 40, we're going to need to go public. So at some point, the consumer will be able to invest in us through the public markets.
Interesting. Changing the meaning behind power plants. Eh?
Yes,
That's fun.
exactly. Right.
Um,
So there
um,
is a roadmap for us to have, I'll call it self-service, right? Licensable, smaller versions that will be great for rural communities. Will be great for universities, institutions, public institutions, municipal authorities, right? Nonprofits, both domestic and international, and other government agencies. That will then they will be able to we can go build one for them, right? Put it on their premises, build it, and then they'll be able to run it themselves. And in that case, the business model is just a license, and they're not really looking to make a profit off of those. They just want to supply the greens to their communities, or and then they go
yeah.
raise donations to go, for the operational expenses of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's quite fascinating, especially with the effects of climate change continuing to kind of mess up a lot of different parts of the world. I was always curious to understand, some of these countries, they don't exactly have the infrastructure to be able to grow a lot of these things, right? So,
Right.
greens is one of them. I guess one of the other big questions I was keen to understand from what you guys can do is, what do you anticipate being the key things that can be grown in this manner that can really be super efficiently grown like this?
Yeah, if especially from a nonprofit level or a governmental support level, we can grow about 200 different varietals of leafy greens, herbs, fruiting crops, right? Flowers even, right? So there's a lot of what we can grow. If you need to make it economically sustainable, like each of these units economically sustainable, there's probably 75 varietals that we can grow that will make money on a consistent basis if you got the operational expenses pretty efficient. So it's a question of what you can grow versus what you should grow. And what you should grow is really based on the premise of why you're running it. If it's licensed out to a nonprofit, then they're not looking to make money off of it. They may want to break even, right? But so then if you're running a break even model that a nonprofit will then fund year after year, or just even just fund a little bit, then that will dictate what kind of varietals that you can grow. But if you're a government agency who's just like, hey, we want to build one of these, we want to run it, and we'll feed it, we'll feed the beast every year for operational expenses, but the output is greens that our community can eat, then that's a totally different setup, and then you can grow a lot more things in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it would be fascinating to see if there are ever governments that decide to implement that, because we see a lot of different ideas kind of in the social, I guess, services that are provided for
Right.
people, individuals. That'd be interesting to see if any countries decide to move that way. I did want to ask, I guess, kind of broadly speaking, what are your thoughts in general, kind of on a very macro level, on how society may advance to become kind of a more micro ecosystem
Mm-hmm.
once we have these technologies kind of really widely dispersed?
Yeah, I mean, from a macro trend, you're seeing a lot more of this infrastructure being decentralized, right? So just in general, the decentralization, and I'll call it the resiliency of communities, is becoming more and more of an issue. And I think the pandemic has accelerated that, because people have realized, hey, from a national infrastructure, whether it's transportation, supply, power, or whatnot, you just can't depend on it nationally, right? So 30,000 foot global level, you're seeing it's not the end of internationalization or globalism, right? But it really is. Countries are trying to take care of themselves more, right? All the trade pacts are changing, the NAFTAs and the EUs of the world, they're all changing, and it's just this overall trend towards taking care of our own. Call it regionalism, call it whatever you want, right? Politically, call it nationalism, but that's the deal. So if you see that on a macro trend, so then at the 20,000 or 10,000 foot level, okay, so within the country, okay, you're taking care of yourselves within the country. What then? Like, what can you do? What's decentralized? What's centralized? And on every single level, you're seeing a decentralization. You're seeing a hub and spoke, but multiple hubs and multiple spokes model, right? Because the decentralization, whether it's talking about cloud computing or whether it's talking about infrastructure, greens like us, if one hub goes down, there's one that can take its place, right? There's a redundancy and resiliency there. And then even among the urban settings, if you look at some of the Urban Institute, or you look at some of the cities and governors that are all getting together, a big recurring theme from state to state and from city to city is city resiliency. And okay, if things go south, if something happens, even if a recession happens right now, what are cities and towns doing to make themselves more resilient to those type of external factors? So if you take all of those trends together and then you overlay that on the food supply system, then what do you get? And it's the same question. How do we make food production more decentralized and more resilient to these external factors? And so that's where we play in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it is really fascinating. Obviously, from, you mentioned the kind of global trade issues that kind of pop up, and yeah, obviously we have some issues right now. I think that it'd be unwise to think that they won't come up again if this is solved, right? So I think that any intelligent person would assume that, hey, there should definitely be a little bit more resiliency, perhaps even if it does cost more, right? To be able to have that optionality. That optionality is important. So that'd be fascinating. One thing I wanted to kind of ask about is, are there any things being done now, maybe not that Eating Green is doing per se, but in general, kind of in this food space, on the data side of things, to try to at least get a better understanding of real-time demand for changing kind of appetites, if you will, for what they're eating, what people are eating, and what grocers might know. Hey, I know what to order now, and it can help inform the growers.
Yeah, so grocers have a great, especially some of the bigger ones, have a great analytics team usually on staff that and it's usually housed with their buyers, and they know just from historical data, right? Every year that passes, data gathering gets better, right? So from the historical data, as you analyze that, you can tell when trends of like, hey, down south in Thanksgiving, the demand for collard greens goes up. And then after Christmas, it goes back down again, right? So you kind of see those trends and patterns of buying. The problem is, and anyone in any of these distributors or retailers will tell you, the problem is not on the demand side. They know exactly what the customer wants. The problem's on the supply side. As big as, a Walmart or an Albertsons or a Kroger gets, every single one of those buyers and those analytics teams will tell you the farms are a black hole of data. They just are. Because you don't know what you're going to get until it actually shows up on your dock. You just don't, right? A farm could be going, and remember, farms only get 3 or 4 harvests a year. So a farm could be going for 60, 70 days, and they think, we're on spot. We're great. You can get delivered on Friday. On Friday, you're going to get, 2 million pounds on your docks, ready to go. On day 69, there's a storm. Boom. Guess what? You're not getting that on your docks, right? So the supply end is the black hole of data, not the market end. And right? So when you try to solve for that, every single retailer and distributor and everyone along that food chain is trying to solve for predictions, like predictability and probability on the supply side. If you can solve for that, you got it. You got something special.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. It's almost as if, because it's in a controlled environment in the growing houses, it's almost like a manufacturing plant, right? You can kind of tweak and measure the output. I guess I'm curious on the same topic of data. You mentioned that existing kind of infrastructure, the conventional way, the black hole of data. What are some of the things that you might be doing now or thinking about doing in the future, kind of in regarding to outputting that data, and also to really make it more transparent what the buyers are getting? Because I know there's a big push for ESG at the moment, and a lot of people asking for verification of their data. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I had a potential capital partner come in last week, and we were just talking, and she was walking through the greenhouse, met some of our management team, and she noted just kind of a matter of fact side note. She's like, you guys are a data and tech company, and you're just growing a lot of produce as well. And I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. right? So from our end, it really starts with the way our culture, like one of our core values is being data obsessed. I don't care if you're an hourly worker picking greens, or if you're on the harvest team, or if you're, seeding, or, you're on my executive team, you better be data obsessed. And it's because when you're data obsessed, then you want to make sure, one, your data is accurate and robust, and there's integrity. And then two, you just want to make sure you have all the inputs you can possibly get, right? You can't manage what you can't measure. So from our end, personally, what we're, as a company, what we're doing is really continuing to obsess over data and the integrity of it, so that when our investors come and ask, like, hey, how much water are you using per cup, or per yield, per harvest, right? How much light electricity are you using? What's your carbon offsets, right? What are all the inputs and what you're saving on the outputs? How much waste do you have? We're capturing that as granularly as possible, so that we can then use those later down the road for whatever purposes they want, either from an audit purpose, from a ESG benefits purpose, from just from a reporting perspective. We are focused on the clarity and the integrity of that data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's quite interesting. I think that is very good foresight, obviously, to, especially at the idea of potentially going public at some point, that'd be certainly required. One thing I'm kind of curious about, given that this is kind of almost like manufacturing to some extent, do you see a lot of areas for operational efficiency improvements, kind of the same way you look at like a Tesla, for example, where they had to get things rolling and then there was massive efficiency ability? Do you see a lot of that down the road?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our world, there are really three ways that three sort of God metrics, if you will: yield per plant spot, operational expenses per plant spot, and then the last one is patent portfolio and sort of expansion of innovation. And so in each three of those, all of our teams are working towards improvements on those, right? If you can increase the yield per harvest, then you're it's a straight direct correlation to top line revenue. And if you can increase the yield and it's on the plant level, then what ends up happening is there's really no extra operational expenses. So everything on that top line rolls down to the bottom. From an operational standpoint, I'll tell you right now, we haven't even started on automation. So for the business listeners out there, we get 35% EBITDA starting out on each greenhouse. That is, you could probably hear people's jaws drop right now, because most farmers pride themselves on 5% EBITDA, and most regular businesses, like my last business that I had, we would be popping champagne bottles if we got 25% EBITDA. So I'm getting 35% EBITDA on conventionally priced lettuce. There's a lot to go up from there. Surprisingly, we've got some stuff up our sleeve, the most of which is automation, but there's a lot of other things there. We're doing that with 25 employees in a greenhouse, doing manual seeding and harvesting and packing. So you can imagine there's some operational efficiencies there if we choose to do so. So that's a big if, and it goes back to, how I got started in this and what our values are. And it's that I want this to be a net benefit for not just for society at large, but also for our local community. And if I can employ 25 people and get a 35% EBITDA, gosh, at what point do you just start getting greedy, right? And then you start saying, okay, what if we can employ only 10 people in a greenhouse? Well, what if we can, right? I'm not saying we won't, but that's not really the question I want to ask, right?
Yeah, at some point, I think this is a very interesting topic. It's come up before when I was discussing the issue with I believe, Ryan Kemp, I believe. And we talked about this, right? It's at what point does profits kind of matter so much that you can essentially, tank the social impact of the business that it can make, can be a very positive impact. for a lot of people. So that's quite interesting. I think that's very thoughtful process and interesting to hear. I am kind of curious if you have any insight to the general public or the general trend around how things might look in 5 to 10 years from kind of an individual consumer's perspective to grow their own food. I know there's a number of people out there. I come from a place in the middle of nowhere where my mom grows a garden every year. And that feeds a lot of what we do throughout the year. So I'm just kind of curious your general opinion and what you're seeing in the trends there.
I think, listen, I think it's well-intentioned. And I think a lot of people have good intentions on growing their own food, right? But for those folks, I think there is a trend. There will be a trend in more backyard gardens, right? More windowsill gardens, which is great. You can grow some amazing herbs in a windowsill. But when it comes to everyday feeding of people, we have got a long way to go before we're able to decentralize food production down to a household level, right? At some point, that decentralization stops because there's just not either the willingness or the ability to, right? Here in Dallas, I think that the stat is somewhere around only 35% of people own their own homes, right? So that really breaks in the question, like how many of the 65% of people that don't own their own homes, so they're renting, maybe they're not single family homes, maybe they're in a townhouse, an apartment, right? Multifamily of building. How many of those can actually afford to have the space to, or are willing to grow their own food? I think it's a really small percentage. It's just the reality.
Yeah, and I think also, of course, at some point the efficiency breaks down. So that kind of on the macro, you end up significantly reducing the overall efficiency of what you're doing. And I know, for example, in New York, there's probably a good number of well-intentioned people who might want to do something like that. So there's also a lot of people who just simply wouldn't have the time if they wanted to even.
Yeah.
So quite interesting. I think we sort of touched on this before, but I'd be keen to hear if you have any other additional thoughts on this, kind of when we look at the geopolitical landscape and things shifting with kind of the food insecurity issues, especially looks like Africa is going to face because of the grain shortages, et cetera.
Yeah.
Any kind of big comments on generally how this technology can help avoid these things in the future? Maybe any just general thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's a question of what we can grow versus what we should grow. On a macro trend, what I see happening is for the things, for the 90% of greens coming out of Salinas and Yuma, I think there's going to be a reckoning there sheerly because of water shortage, not because of anything we're doing. Take away from the market share that we'll be taking from them and more thinking about just water, right? What can you grow there? What ought you to grow there? So there's a question of like, should those farms even be replaced with something else? But I think for other farms, I think there's a very, very real possibility of companies like ours, maybe not ours, but companies like ours who maybe focus on things that they can grow really well, and then allows the farms to then grow things that they can grow really well that have higher margins for them, right? So it really is a competitive, they really realize their competitive advantage in what they can grow depending on their geography. And then I will say, like, eating green is not a silver bullet for farming. We're just not. And there is no silver bullet for farming. It's going to take a combination of your traditional open field farmers, whether they're in California, Iowa, Nebraska, or Pennsylvania, right? It's going to take those folks plus folks like us to really feed the nation.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I find it fascinating being from a family of both my parents were farmers growing up, dairy farmers. So I think that the mentality amongst especially small farming communities usually to kind of stick with the old ways and not necessarily super quick to adapt new technology. So I think it will be fascinating to see how the agriculture industry as a whole does change over the coming years, right?
Yeah.
So thanks for that. I think it's really helpful to understand. One thing I want to go into kind of on the workforce side of things, you mentioned it a little bit already, but could you maybe give us a breakdown of, on average, kind of what are we going to, how many headcount required to operate these facilities? What's the training required? Just kind of talking a little bit about the workforce in general, because that is an issue in some places like California, for example, where
Yeah,
they're very difficult
absolutely.
to find workforce.
So two aspects about the workforce. One, when you're like us and we're located adjacent to, co-located to a distribution center, then you really have access to a wider workforce because you're in or around the urban population, right? So the workforce is much, the workforce pool, the employee pool is much deeper. When it comes to actual employees on our staff, we've got roughly 25 greenhouse employees per greenhouse. And those will range from hourly workers all the way to, your greenhouse managers, your agronomists, right? Your food safety specialists. And those hourlies really start off, they don't have college degrees. They have high school degrees. They can learn the basics of working in our greenhouse in probably 8 hours. It's really not that hard of an uptake. But one of the things that we want to do, that we're doing with our current employees, is that I'm a baseball fan, and the pun is not lost on me, but we want to create our own farm team, right, of workers that start with hourly, then work their way up to be assistant grow, managers and greenhouse managers and agronomists and whatnot, food safety, planting, packaging, ops, facilities, right? We want to grow their professional careers so they can fill those roles. I would much rather fill those roles with folks who have been in our company for a long time, rather than getting an expensive free agent, if you will. So that's the plan, is to educate them from within the system. And as we build this mesh network out, then all of a sudden they will know if they can operate one in Texas, they'll be able to operate one in Indiana, the same one in Minneapolis, the same one in New Jersey, the same one in Atlanta, same one in North Carolina, right? So they'll actually be open to upward mobility and geographic mobility where they had never been able to do that before, simply by starting at the ground floor of one of our greenhouses.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It brings a bit of equity to an industry that perhaps didn't really have it before, right? I
Yeah.
think it's very interesting. Obviously, my day job being recruitment, it's very fascinating to see somebody actually doing this, because it's been kind of a thesis of what we've seen for a long time, is farming your talent internally. Again, no pun intended, but I think it's very fascinating. So, pat yourself on the back for that one. That's very good, and I think it'll be beneficial to so many people. I am curious to hear, based on that comment, if you have any specific thoughts in general on the education landscape. I think that there's a lot of discussion lately about the value of a college education in a general, maybe kind of just an average school, for example. Do you have any thoughts about this and how it may change over the coming years, especially with companies in the climate tech space that are kind of in the intersection of technology and hardware?
Yeah, I think there will continue to be a need for advanced degrees and college degrees in our field, obviously, for innovation, especially agronomy. I mean, that is a difficult degree to get. It gets into science and STEM, right? And I think there's a place for that. And then I think there's a place. It's a pretty funny thing. Like, our industry is poised to be a good mix of both advanced degrees as well as vocational degrees, right? And the trades, right? I need one of the most valuable people in my organization is our greenhouse facility manager, right? Don't need a college degree for that. You do need to know a lot about different types of machinery, about plumbing, about electric, right? There's just a facilities management, and that's a big facility. So you think about the mix of those, and you think about just the machinery involved, and we have 7 miles of pipe in an 1.5 acre facility. Wow, does a plumber have a job for life, right? I think there's a need for both in our industry, and I think where we can hire, we will, but where we can train is even more important. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's also fascinating to me that I think there will be more companies doing this. From what I've seen, this is a really good example of a company doing this. But I think that it will come down to there will be specialists who are very, very good, science people. They understand the kind of the engineering aspects of things. But then there will be people who will decide, hey, maybe I don't need to go to university because there's actually a very good career path in many options, not just Eating Green Technologies, other companies in other industries that will also do the same thing, where the trade-off of spending all that debt and that time, you can kind of get into life sooner and just learn things and make a living for your family. Because not everyone's trying to be, a millionaire or billionaire. A lot of people just want to live a nice life. They don't necessarily care about anything in particular.
Yeah.
So I think it's really fascinating to see how this dichotomy will come together. And I do think personally that there's a bit of a division typically between college educated and kind of blue collar workers, as white collar and blue collar. And I think that we need to see that kind of come together and get rid of that division. But the only one major question I have left is really in general, now that this problem is being solved, kind of it's at least kind of at the crux of it, it's solved. What are the problems that need to be solved now after this to really enable this infrastructure to be built kind of at least within the US?
Gosh, that's such a huge question. I'll try to winnow it down to something more manageable. But I think I would say the biggest problem is education. Like people don't know, they don't know what hydroponic is. They think it's, they equate that. A lot of them equate that like, okay, is that genetically modified? Like, is that grown in a lab? Like, what does that mean, right? So there's an education piece of CEA, which is controlled environment agriculture. That's going to be, that will continue to be a trend for us. And that's something where Eating Green is leading the way, is with education. Like if you go to our website, a lot of that stuff is not even on our tech. Actually, very little of it is on our tech. And the videos that you see, I think my head of agriculture on YouTube has a video series called Spill the Greens. And it really is just an educational, like, hey, here's what hydroponics is. Here's how plants are grown. Here's how they, all the, here's why they seed, what happens. So there's this great education piece that we're trying to build out that I think will continue to be important. And I think the second thing, and that's from the consumer side, really the second thing is from the government side. A lot of the grants and subsidies and the way that government support is designed is for open field farming and the traditional farmer. And if you're going to get this industry to grow, because the government needs a more stable and consistent supply of food, you're going to have to be a good government, a good servant of the taxpayer by looking at subsidies and grants and laws and regulations in a way that encompasses CEA, the CEA industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating. That topic of regulation is always interesting to me. That obviously existing regulation tends to stifle potential innovation because people are so used to doing it the other way, or the grants are there, et cetera. It'd be also interesting to see, the more areas where this technology becomes used, this vertical growing, really can free up, I would assume, depending on at what scale and which items can be grown, you can actually free up quite a lot of land space used for other things, right? So I think, especially maybe not so much for the U.S. it's an issue, but for other countries where they're kind of space constricted, it might be interesting. But any final thoughts you want to leave us with? Final things, people, what you're looking for, people can reach out to you for whatever.
Yeah, if people are interested in learning more, I would say just go to edengreen.com. And on the socials, they're all at Eating Green Tech. And if people want to learn more about me, it's just my last name, Badrina, Badrina.com. You can find me there.
Awesome. Very good. Thanks so much for coming on. Really enjoyed this and looking forward to being able to share this with everybody.
Thanks, Silas.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and thank you for tuning in. We really appreciate any comments or thoughts you might have on the show. If there's any specific topics that you really liked and you wanted to talk about, feel free to drop us a note. Always glad to discuss off the record as well and kind of hear your thoughts. If you have ideas for future episodes, always glad to hear them. Of course, we really encourage people to reach out to Eden, to reach out to Eddy directly on LinkedIn to learn more about Eden. Perhaps you know somebody who might be interested in working there. or somebody who just might be really interested to learn about this technology, you can maybe share this episode with somebody who's interested to learn about the space. If you are joining us for the first time and you enjoyed the show, we ask, of course, please give us a review, give us feedback directly over Slack, whatever it is. It really helps a lot to get feedback from listeners. And just a quick note on our next episode, we will be joined by Greg Fasulo from Elevation. And in that episode, we discuss how they are helping visualize energy usage for homeowners. Secondly, how they are also installing solar to help reduce environmental impacts and save money. And then thirdly, how they are helping utilities manage demand response programs through their kind of interactive platform that they can use once they have a number of homes connected to the grid. So really very interesting episode with Greg. He does an extremely good job at making what is sometimes a pretty confusing topic to a lot of homeowners very, very simple to understand. And he did a very good job also extolling the benefits of solar in a very, very kind of simple way. It's really, really well done, honestly. So really looking forward to sharing that episode with you next time. But until then, thank you again for listening to the CleanTechies Podcast, and we will see you next time.